Hello and welcome back to another edition of Ruby Minutes where we spend some time together discussing fun, interesting, creative things to do with the Ruby programming language. My name is Ben Greenberg and I'm a developer advocate at Nexmo, the Vonage API platform. In our last time together, we discussed initializing static type checking into your Ruby existing code base, and we initialized the Sorbet gems in our project and ran our initial check. Today, we're going to transition and actually introduce some checking of one file. And the first level of checking that's going to happen with Sorbet is actually not checking for types necessarily. We're going to check for code conformity and code quality. That's the first step that happens when we change on the top line here from what was initially written as false to true. We're now going to check for types. So when we change type to true, and we run the Sorbet executable, the command line interface, by checking for types. At that point, we're going to encounter actually two distinct errors that pop up in this SMS class now that we have changed it to true. And what are our two errors? So our two errors are unable to resolve the constant GSM7. And this points, by the way, very helpfully to the Sorbet documentation, to the error code that it's referencing, error code 5002. That's our first error. And our second error down here is the method request does not exist on Nexmo SMS, the module Nexmo and the class SMS. What method? The request method. And that's on line 107. That's actually the bulk of this file here, is the actual request to send an SMS. Request takes in the endpoint, the SMS/JSON, the parameters, calling this method hyphenate, which comes from the keys class, which we include if you look in the very top of the file. We include keys from Nexmo keys, and it takes in a type with post and response class of response, which comes from the Nexmo response class. So we have two distinct errors here. One is we don't know what is this GSM7 constant that we're referencing down here in the private method of Unicode, where we say if not GSM7 encoded with text. What is GSM7? Well, GSM7, as we see our helpful IDE is telling us, is from the Nexmo GSM7 class. Well, it exists, so why is the type checking telling us that it's an error? So let's take a look at the GSM7 file itself. And we take a look at the GSM7 file, we find something very interesting. First of all, we see that we're ignoring this file for type checking. All is well. We have not yet introduced it here. But we do see at the very end on line 13, we have defined this as a private constant. Private constant is a argument that you can provide a list of existing constants to make as private. And as such, GSM7 as a private constant is not available to be called directly. It's not always accessible. Will not always necessarily be accessible because it's in part of the private interface. So what the error is telling us actually is that this GSM7 will not always be available. And in fact, we take a look at the actual error that we see there. The actual error we see is this means a type checker has been unable to resolve a reference to a constant. Most commonly, this indicates there's a typo. We know we don't have a typo. So what is it then? Well, is it coming from a gem? It's not coming from a gem. It does not. It looks to the gem source code. It must be in the RBI file. It's not there. Instead, it's not actually being able to find it directly because it's not part of the public interface. So there's a couple ways we can address this. The simplest way, and this of course depends on the design architecture of your application, but the simplest way to address this is if we don't need to make it a private constant, let's actually just comment it out and see what happens. So once we comment out something, by the way, we need to regenerate the hidden definitions file within the Sorbet file folder structure. So we want to reinitialize the hidden definitions, and we do that by running the Sorbet CLI with an argument of RBI, which is the RBI files, and we're saying regenerate the ones that were not yet known to us, including what was in there before was GSM7. If we remove the private constant reference on line 13 and we regenerate that file, which takes a few seconds to regenerate that file, that error should actually now go away when we run the type check. Because now we have made the GSM7 constant publicly available. So now if we run type check, we now have eliminated that error. We now are down to one error as opposed to two errors. And this second error is an interesting one as well. This one says method request does not exist on Nexmo SMS, Nexmo module SMS class, and referencing, as we said before, line 107, this request method call here, which is coming from the namespace class. Let's take a look at the namespace class. First, actually, let's take a look at the error code again, because why not? The error code tells us this indicates a call to a method we believe does not exist. Does it actually run? The code actually does run. We know that for a fact, because the method might not always be there. What does it actually mean that might not always be there? Well, let's take a look at that together. So if we take a look at the actual namespace class here, we see, again, the private constant namespace, okay, but we also see, where is this request method defined? This request method is defined as part of the private interface of this class. There are many design choices why one might do that, but if we're directly calling it in our SMS class and in the send method, and we're directly calling the request method, then perhaps we can actually change and move the request method to being part of the public interface of the class. So we're going to do something here a little radical. We're actually going to take this entire method, delete it out of the private interface, and we're going to put it into the public interface. What will happen if we do that? Let's just make sure it all looks nice. That's always important. It looks fine. And we're going to, again, regenerate that hidden definitions because we've changed things at this point and it's no longer hidden, right? So we're going to regenerate the hidden definitions. This takes a minute. As we regenerate those RBI files, we know from over here, these RBI files, specifically the hidden definitions ones. And all these files over here, we regenerated. And then we'll run the type check again. No errors. So now at this point, we actually have not introduced method signatures yet into our file here. But what we have done is we made sure our code conforms to the standards that Sorbet is asking for, mainly that we know that everything is publicly accessible, that the methods will always be there, and that they are clearly defined in the code architecture. So the next step for us in our next video will be adding method signatures to these actual methods. See you then.